Elijah Merrick kept his promises, even the ones no one heard him make. The sun had yet to break through the Virginia pines when Elijah arrived at Saddlewood Crest, a gated community nestled just outside Richmond. The sidewalks were already clean blown smooth from last night's gusts. His steel-toed boots crunched softly as he walked the south perimeter toolbox. In one hand, the faded olive windbreaker zipped against the morning chill. There was no name on the back, no emblem. Just threadbare fabric worn at the shoulders and elbows, years of rust paint, and weather stitched into every seam. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, not lazy measured, like someone who knew that doing something right the first time meant fewer regrets later. At 61, Elijah didn't rush, didn't need to. The rusted red toolbox he carried had followed him from forward operating bases in Helmand Province to the back alleys of Norfolk repair shops. It rattled with history. It also held everything he needed to keep the community's walls from crumbling, though few inside Saddlewood knew his name. He crouched near the south gate, eyeing a warped latch that had started to buckle from spring rain. The bolt had shifted just enough for the metal to squeal when forced. Elijah wiped his glasses with a corner of his flannel sleeve and selected a torque wrench. Behind him, pine needles rustled. Then came the soft hum of tires on pavement. He didn't turn. Not at first. A golf cart, one of the HOA-issued two-seaters, pulled up on the path. A man sat behind the wheel-mirrored sunglasses, hiding whatever expression he might have worn. Beside him, a boy, 10, maybe 11, stared at Elijah with polite confusion. He wore a navy sweater with a Saddlewood Tennis Club patch stitched on the chest. "Why do you do that job?" the boy asked. His voice wasn't cruel, just honest. "You get all dirty." Elijah straightened slowly joints, groaning in quiet protest. He wiped his hands on the legs of his jeans and glanced back at the boy. "Because some fences," he said gently, "only stay standing if someone watches them close." The boy wrinkled his nose. "But you don't live here." "No," Elijah said, a small smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "But that don't mean I don't care if folks stay safe inside." The man in the driver's seat didn't speak, just tapped the accelerator and rolled away without acknowledgement. Elijah watched the boy turn to look back, still curious, still confused, not hateful, just trained. That was always the truth about places like Saddlewood. They didn't throw stones. They didn't yell. They just looked through you until they needed you. Elijah turned back to the latch. He etched a faint marking into the underside with a micro-engraver 43B. A note to himself, a quiet warning. The number meant something to him, an internal system for logging vulnerabilities. This one was mild, not urgent. But in his world, the little things were how breaches started. And sometimes the ones who looked the other way paid the steepest price. By the time the sun had risen just past the ridge, Elijah had made his way around to the east gate. The top hinge had bubbled with corrosion-black paint, flaking off in dull strips. He laid down a drop cloth, masked the edges with tape, and opened a can of the same matte black, weatherproof enamel Saddlewood had used for 12 years. He painted in smooth, steady strokes, like clockwork. "Is he painting that gate?" A woman's voice cracked across the morning like a twig underfoot. Elijah didn't stop. He knew the tone. Clipped, high-heeled, confident in its own correctness. "He doesn't even have a supervisor with him," a man added. "That's not scheduled work, is it?" Elijah wiped the rim of the paint can and exhaled quietly. By the time he looked up, 3 residents had gathered behind the hedge, Mr. and Mrs. Dalhart and a woman he didn't know. Dalhart, the HOA president, had his phone out. "You there?" Dalhart called, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" "Standard maintenance," Elijah said, not unkindly. "Eastgate's overdue. Paint's from the same vendor as always. You can check the ledger." "That's not protocol," Dalhart said. "You're working unsupervised, and that paint doesn't match." "I've used it for 3 years," Elijah replied. "Same batch number." Dalhart raised his phone. "I'm calling security." A low growl rose from behind the fence. Elijah turned. Just instinct, not fear. Mrs. Dalhart backed up. He's being aggressive. He won't leave a white security SUV pulled up fast. The young officer who jumped out looked fresh from academy training, rigid posture, hand twitching near his belt. Step away from the gate, he ordered. I have the work order in my truck, Elijah said calmly. Dalhart shoved his phone forward. He's acting hostile. He refused to leave. Elijah's breath caught, but he didn't flinch. He set the paintbrush on the drop cloth. That's when the dog appeared. From the Dalhart side yard, a tan German Shepherd mix burst through an unlatched fence. She charged not at Elijah, but to his side. She sat rigid, protective eyes on the crowd. Her growl was low. Focused. Valor, Elijah whispered. The dog went still. Dalhart froze. How the hell does she know you? I trained her, Elijah said softly. Back when your wife brought her to the shelter. Guess she remembered. Before Dalhart could speak, another security vehicle pulled up. This one faster, louder, more authoritative. Elijah Merrick on the ground, the first officer shouted. Elijah didn't move, but they still forced him down, cheek to concrete, plastic zip ties biting his wrists. His glasses slid across the pavement. He stayed quiet. The dog Valor never moved. She sat like a stone. Loyal. 10 minutes later, a black SUV arrived. Out stepped Arthur Whitman, Elijah's longtime attorney. He didn't raise his voice. Take your hands off him, he said. Who are you? One officer barked. His lawyer Whitman replied, flashing his credentials. And the reason this entire HOA is about to face civil litigation. The cuffs came off, slowly. Elijah stood without a word. He brushed off his jacket, picked up his toolbox, and walked with Arthur to the waiting SUV. The only sound was Valor's steady breath beside him and the low wind passing through the pine. As they drove away, Arthur said quietly, they're going to spin this. Video's already up. Local groups calling it, Aggressive Worker Confronts HOA Dog Intervenes. Elijah closed his eyes. His wrists ached. His pride did more. She remembered me, he said finally. Arthur nodded, and she knew who the threat really was. They drove on in silence, the kind born not of discomfort, but of discipline. The kind you learn when the world only sees you once you're down. The bruise on Elijah's cheek had already begun to fade. The silence hadn't. It was a quiet Tuesday when Elijah Merrick returned to the solitude of his own backyard. Morning sun filtered through the sycamores, casting shifting shadows on the gravel path he'd laid by hand. His knees cracked as he knelt near the tomato beds, Valor watching from a patch of warm concrete near the fence. She hadn't left his side since the incident. He hadn't asked her to. Some bonds didn't need words. He hadn't answered his phone in 2 days. Not the HOA, not the maintenance contractor, not even Miguel from security. The video was everywhere now, over 60,000 views on a local Facebook group called Saddlewood Watchdogs. Elijah didn't click the link. He didn't need to see it. He already knew what they'd show: a quiet man being pushed into the dirt, cuffed beneath a painted gate he had spent a decade keeping upright. And he knew what they wouldn't show, like the years of reports he'd submitted about weak hinges, corroded latches, and codes etched silently beneath rusted frames. They always left that part out. A blue pickup truck rolled past his house that morning. Saddlewood's new contractor, young guy, white polo, clipboard, didn't wave. Just stared like he was already told who Elijah was supposed to be. Elijah turned back to his soil. The tomatoes needed weeding. At least they didn't lie. On the third day, the phone rang again. Elijah picked it up on the fifth ring. You seeing what they're saying? Miguel's voice was quiet, careful. Don't need to. They're replacing you. Said you painted off schedule. Caused a disturbance. Elijah almost laughed. Almost. They say that every time someone like me breathes too loud, he murmured. There was a pause. Look, Miguel continued, voice lowered. You remember that code you etched into the East Gate 43B? Elijah stood up, slowly wiping his hands on his pants. Yeah. What about it? I was on shift last night. Midnight. East perimeter camera picked up motion. Man scaled the fence right at 43B. Same place. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. You sure clear footage? But backup took too long. He was headed toward the upper cul-de-sac. Which house? Elijah Miguel said almost apologetically. Dalhart's. Elijah didn't hesitate. I'll be there in 5. The backyard of the Dalhart property was unnaturally quiet. Lawn lights cast a dull glow across the flagstone path, and the pool shimmered beneath still air. Elijah moved like he had years ago during nighttime patrols in Hellman. Slow, deliberate muscle memory guiding every footstep. His flashlight stayed clipped to his belt. No weapon. Just his hands and a 6-inch baton he'd carried since deployment. Valor trailed behind, low to the ground, a shadow with breath. Near the side garden, a man crouched by a window, crowbar in hand. Pale skin, trim build, black hoodie, mismatched gloves. Put it down, Elijah said, his voice steady. The man spun. Who the hell? He didn't finish. Elijah lunged, crashing his shoulder into the man's ribcage. They tumbled across the mulch. The crowbar clanged onto the stone path. The man scrambled, but Elijah was faster, pinning him, breath ragged. You picked the wrong house, he growled. Lights flicked on. Dalhart appeared at the patio door, robe flapping, mouth hanging open. Stop, what's going on? That's when Valor arrived. No leash, no bark, just purpose. She slid beside Elijah, positioning herself between him and the fallen man, eyes locked. Guarding. Dalhart stared. That man he was breaking in. Elijah stood slowly, chest heaving. Yeah, he said. And your community suspended the only person who could stop him. Dalhart didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth had already filled the space Valor left between them. The news didn't break immediately. Saddlewood's HOA scrambled to control the story, but cell phones had been recording again. The footage was too clear, too damning. It showed the same man, same dog, same gate, and a different kind of confrontation. But once again, Elijah wasn't in the press release. The official bulletin thanked Officer Riggs, who had arrived 7 minutes late, and stood watching as Elijah zip-tied the intruder with Miguel's flashlight, casting shaky light on the scene. There was no mention of the prior warning. No mention of the code. They wrote you out again? Miguel said later that morning, reading aloud from the HOA's bulletin. The HOA thanks local responders for protecting our residents in a time of uncertainty. He tossed the paper onto Elijah's porch table. Elijah, sipping coffee, said nothing. Miguel leaned forward. You gonna let them keep doing that? They never wrote me in, Elijah replied softly. That afternoon, Arthur Whitman called. They're holding an emergency HOA meeting this Friday. Closed door, members only. Wasn't expecting an invite. I was, Arthur said. Because the footage, it's already circulating. And this time it doesn't lie. Later that day, Elijah walked along his own fence. Not Saddlewood's. His. The one he'd rebuilt after Hurricane Isaias. Not because anyone asked, because that's what you do when you care about keeping people safe, even when they don't see it. There, nailed into the cedar post, was the plaque they'd handed him hastily, Elijah Merrick for service to Saddlewood. And below that, etched in brass, 43B, the code we should have seen. Elijah stood there for a long moment. Then quietly he pulled the plaque from the porch and drove it into the post by his own gate. Not theirs. His. Because when a place pretends not to see you sometimes, the only way to stay whole is to build your own walls, ones that still let truth through. By the time Friday rolled around, the meeting wasn't just private anymore, and Saddlewood's silence was about to crack wide open. By Friday morning, the gated walls of Saddlewood Crest weren't keeping much in anymore. Not the truth, and certainly not the silence. Elijah Merrick hadn't planned on leaving the house that day. He sat on his porch with Valor lying at his feet, the sun rising soft and orange behind the branches of the black gum trees. He sipped his coffee, slowly watching the light creep across his newly tightened fence. The plaque was still there, his own, not Saddlewood's. 43B, the code we should have seen. He hadn't carved the words, but someone had. And they meant more nailed into cedar than printed in a glossy HOA bulletin. The phone vibrated in his shirt pocket. It was Miguel. "It's happening," Miguel said. "Right now. HOA meeting's packed. Reporters are outside. They're asking why the guy who saved everyone twice isn't even in the minutes." Elijah didn't reply. He only exhaled long and low. Miguel continued quieter. "Someone leaked the full security footage. Yours. The moment you tackled the guy. The gate. Valor. It's all over now." Elijah looked down at his dog, who lifted her head at the mention of her name. She didn't wag her tail. She just watched him as if waiting for instruction. "You should see this," Haley Miguel said finally. "It's not like before." That afternoon, a local station aired the segment. Not in prime time, just tucked between weather and a city council update. But it was enough. The clip showed Elijah, no badge, no backup, crossing the lawn like a man who'd done it before. It showed him neutralizing the intruder in seconds. It showed Valor arriving, eyes locked, body still. It showed residents shouting, not helping. It showed the breach exactly where Elijah had warned. Twice. The voiceover was quiet, respectful. The former Army engineer and longtime contractor for Saddlewood Crest, Elijah Merrick, responded alone. Community residents confirm he'd previously identified the exact weak point now exploited in both attempted break-ins. Social media filled in what the HOA wouldn't. Twitter posts tagged with "The Man at Gate 43B." Facebook groups sharing screenshots of Elijah zip-tying the suspect while Valor kept watch. The image was striking a man the community tried to ignore, kneeling beside a subdued threat, the very dog once labeled aggressive, sitting beside him like a sentinel. Even the local news anchor paused before signing off. "Sometimes the quiet ones," she said, "are the ones holding the line." By evening, the crowd had gathered. They stood near the east entrance, resident staff, a few curious outsiders who'd seen the story unfold online. A brass plaque had been bolted into the steel frame of the once overlooked gate. It read, "In honor of Elijah Merrick, the one who saw the weakness before we did. Gate 43B." The wind was gentle that night, a rare softness drifting across the trimmed hedges. Porch lights flicked on one by one, and from the back of the crowd a familiar voice cleared his throat. Arthur Whitman stepped forward, dressed in a dark gray suit that somehow made him look older than he was. He didn't read from notes. He didn't need to. "This man," he said, gesturing toward Elijah, who stood at the edge of the sidewalk, toolbox in hand, was thrown to the ground 1 week ago. Cuffed, humiliated, for doing his job, for protecting this community. He turned toward the residents. And then when the same gate was breached again, when real danger walked through the exact vulnerability he warned you about, he came back. Not because he was paid to, not because he was praised, but because he knew someone had to stand where the breach was. There was silence, not defensive, reflective. Then Arthur looked directly at Dalhart, who had hovered near the back in slacks and a beige windbreaker that didn't quite hide the weight of shame on his shoulders. "This plaque is not redemption," Arthur said. "It's recognition, and it's overdue." He stepped back. The crowd turned to Elijah. Someone offered him a ribbon-cutting pair of scissors, silver handles glinting in the light. Elijah didn't move. He looked at Miguel, who had stood off to the side the whole time, hat in hand, eyes lowered like a man unsure he belonged. "You do it," Elijah said, voice even. "You helped hold the line too." Miguel blinked. Me, Elijah gave the smallest nod. With trembling fingers, Miguel stepped forward, lifted the scissors, and cut the red ribbon tied across the gate. There was no cheer, no applause. Just a long silence that settled heavy on the neighborhood, like a storm finally passed. Later, Elijah walked home with Valor beside him. He didn't stop by the HOA office. Didn't speak to the reporters still parked at the Saddlewood entrance. He didn't need their sound bites. He already had what mattered: a gate reinforced, a symbol restored, and just barely the beginning of a shift in the air. When they reached his porch, Miguel followed a few paces behind. "Eli," he said quietly. "The contractor, the new guy, he asked for your diagrams. Said he wants to use them in the other developments. You good with that?" Elijah turned. "You tell him I'll send him a clean copy," he said. "But he needs to know fences don't hold just because they're built well. They hold because someone's always watching." Miguel nodded and after a moment turned to go. Elijah sat on his porch. Valor curled tight at his feet, the lights of Saddlewood flickering in the distance like stars, unsure if they should still shine. And from that night forward, Gate 43B had a name, and the man who gave it meaning didn't need to speak for anyone to remember. They called it the gate that held, but Elijah never thought in monuments. A week passed, maybe more. Time had its own pace in Saddlewood Crest. The roses still bloomed in neat lines, the lawns remained striped with military precision, and the morning sprinklers hissed on cue. But something underneath had shifted, soft as soil after the first thaw. Elijah Merrick returned to work, not because he was reinstated, though the HOA sent an apology letter signed in 5 different pens, but because Miguel had called. Not as a security officer this time, but as a friend. "We need you," Miguel had said. "But more than that, I think people finally see you." Elijah didn't care about being seen. He cared about what was left behind. That was the difference. On a foggy Tuesday just before dawn, he stepped back through the front gate of Saddlewood Toolbox, in hand windbreaker, zipped against the chill Valor, trailing close behind like always. No camera crews this time. No whispered apologies or fanfare. Just a list of tasks and the quiet confidence of someone who understood that integrity was built not in headlines, but in hinges, screws, and steady hands. He began at the northwest fence line. The post had loosened after last month's rain. No one had noticed, not yet, but he had. Elijah bent low fingers, brushing the soft earth where the metal met the ground. A fine crack had formed near the hinge, barely visible unless you knew where to look. He pulled a long military-grade anchor from his personal supply, threaded differently than the factory-stock Saddlewood used. And with slow, practiced force, he drove it into place, sealing the breach no one else had seen. As he worked, a woman walked by with her dog. She didn't look away this time, didn't clutch her phone or cross the path to avoid him. "Good morning, Mr. Merrick," she said, voice warm but simple. Elijah nodded, still crouched by the fence. "Morning?" That was all. Nothing more was needed. Or was. Later that week, Miguel joined him on his rounds. They walked the perimeter together, both quiet for a long stretch. "Funny," Miguel said, gesturing to the reinforced fence line. "How it took 2 near break-ins for people to realize you weren't just patching wood and metal." "I wasn't," Elijah replied. Miguel looked over, eyes narrowing. "Then what were you fixing?" Elijah paused, glanced out at the homes behind the fence, the manicured backyards, the trimmed hedges, the silent security cameras blinking like lazy eyes. "The idea," he said slowly, "that someone like me could be ignored without consequence." By Friday, something new appeared beneath the plaque at Gate 43B. It wasn't HOA issued. It wasn't in any newsletter. But there it was, a single shiny silver screw embedded just below the brass plate. At first, Elijah thought it was a mistake. He squatted down, turned his flashlight on it. The head of the screw had an engraving. Tiny. Clean. You held the line. He didn't know who put it there. No one ever claimed it. But that wasn't the point. It wasn't meant for display. It was meant to hold quietly, permanently, like him. Not long after Saddlewood began a quiet but firm shift. New staff were onboarded with a 12-page protocol packet titled Merrick Safety Standards, complete with hand-drawn diagrams Elijah had created over the years. He hadn't demanded it. Luis had. And this time the board had agreed, not from guilt, not from pressure, but from respect. The kind that held up even in storms. Elijah didn't speak at the next HOA meeting, though he attended. He sat near the back with Valor at his feet. He didn't raise objections. He didn't need to. When a new proposal passed to inspect all Saddlewood's perimeter gates using his checklist, no one opposed it. A week later, a white SUV pulled up outside Elijah's home. Dalhart stepped out alone. No sunglasses, no bravado. Just a man with weariness on his shoulders and humility in his walk. Elijah stood on his porch, arms crossed. Dalhart stopped at the bottom step. "Why'd you come back?" he asked. After everything, Elijah looked past him toward the fence line. The new screws gleamed slightly in the sun. "Because I'd rather fix something broken," he said, "than pretend it was strong all along." Dalhart didn't have a response, not one that mattered. That evening, as the sun sank behind the treetops, a group of neighborhood children played near Gate 43B. One of them, tall, thin, in a tennis club sweater too clean to be worn, twice walked across the lawn toward Elijah, who stood near the edge of the path with Valor sitting tall at his side. The boy held out a small bottle of water. "For your dog," he said. Elijah took it gently. "Thank you." "What's her name?" the boy asked. "Valor." "She doesn't look scary anymore." "She never was," Elijah said, crouching beside her. "You just didn't know who she was standing guard for." The story didn't end at Saddlewood. It spread. Contractors from nearby counties began using the Merrick codes to audit their own gates. A safety blog published a piece titled, "The Man Who Marked 43B." And every once in a while, a stranger showed up at the Saddlewood entrance just to see the plaque, just to read the screw. Most never knocked on Elijah's door. They didn't need to. He had already shown them what mattered. That legacy wasn't marble or headlines or front-page praise. Legacy was in what held after you walked away in the fence, that stayed upright in the gate, that didn't buckle in the people who finally chose to stop looking past and start looking in. And long after Elijah Merrick stopped walking, that perimeter years from now, when the wind wore the paint and the brass tarnished, someone would still see that screw, read those 4 words, and remember the man who didn't just fix fences. He fortified the truth. Hoi ChatGPT. Griffith Webermarin Chum.